This is Ben Weingarten in for Andrew Wilkow on the Wilkow Majority. All right, we're up against a break shortly, but I did want to bring on Tony Badran. He's a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he focuses on Lebanon, Hezbollah, Syria, and the geopolitics of the Levant. Tony, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure.
So, Tony, let's jump right into it. There was actually breaking news in the last 24 hours in the Middle East of an alleged Israeli attack within Syria outside of Damascus, potentially on some Hezbollah leaders, as well as potentially on weapons depots. What can you tell us about what's gone on?
Sure. It doesn't seem that the Hezbollah leader's story is actually panning out. It remains unverified, but it seems to be that there was some sort of an attack on either a weapons shipment that was just delivered or some depots, warehouses basicute containing Iranian either actual missiles or missile components that would be en route to Hezbollah in Lebanon, where in the effort to upgrade their stockpiles so as to increase their accuracy.
Now, Tony, this is a relevant news story in that Israel itself, which is the primary focus of sort of American national interest in this particular area of the world, in addition to the well-being of our own troops, has indicated not that essentially the world should not freak out about the U.S. impending pullout from Syria, but that Israel would act of its own volition to protect its interests, i.e. attacking weapons and other materials that potentially threaten its territorial integrity from the north, in particular from Syria. How is this so-called pullout going to function? There was a DEBCA report, and it said, and I'm going to quote from it, "The U.S. and Iraq are in advanced negotiations for the deployment to the Iraqi-Syria border of the Iraqi Special Operations Forces, the Golden Division, which drove ISIS out of Mosul. It will stand in the path of Iranian and Iraqi Shiite militia crossings into Syria." So in around a minute or so, tell us how you envision this pullout working.
Well, we'll see if that DEBCA report has any truth to it, because if the idea is to depend on Iraqi forces to intercept any Iranian Shiite militias or weapons transfers through that border, that Iraqi force really needs to be something that has nothing to do with the central authority in Baghdad, which is really aligned with Iran. So I'm very skeptical of that. If the United States wants to build a force there, it's going to have to build it from scratch. But leaving that aside, what the whole point with what we're talking about in Iraq is lies at the heart of the controversy of the Syria withdrawal. People have focused on the losses or the costs of the withdrawal, which are real, which are this idea that enables Iran to transfer personnel and material over a land bridge, so to speak, from Iraq to Lebanon.
Tony, we're going to continue the conversations on the other side of the break. We'll be right back in the Wilkow Majority.
Sequence initiated.
T-minus 3, 2, 1. Ignition.
Wilkow Satcom 1.
We are go.
Wilkow Satcom 2.
The fusion of rational thought and political analysis.
This is what your brain has been waiting for. News, politics, and issues enhanced.
You've just joined the Wilkow Majority.
This is the Wilkow Majority, and this is Ben Weingarten in for Andrew Wilkow here at the top of hour 3. So great that you can make it and listen in here, spend your holiday season with us as we go around the world. And now back to one of the most dangerous places in the world, the Middle East, and in particular, Syria. And before the break, we were just starting to get in a little bit to the president's decision to do what seems like it'll be a phased pullout in coordination with Turkish forces of the 2,000-plus U.S. soldiers that have been in Syria, primarily focused, perhaps solely focused, on rooting out the Islamic State, which was the president's primary desire, what he dictated as the primary core national interest in Syria. And we bring back Tony Badran to the program. Tony, thanks so much again for coming on today.
My pleasure.
So, Tony, I want to start at the highest level of the Syria conversation before getting into the weeds, which is there's been a hysteria over the news of the pullout as if it was something that was shocking when the president has been hinting at this for months. And there are all sorts of tactical, some strategic concerns as well. You'll hear people talk about the fact that we're turning our backs on the Kurds. What will the rest of the world think of us? So there's the loss of prestige issue, potentially. There's the issue of ceding territory to the Turks to lord over potentially the Kurds, who they view these forces that we had allied with as their adversaries who they wish to root out, although thus far it seems as if Erdogan has told his forces to hold back. There's the issue of Russian influence in the Middle East broadly and in Syria in particular. There's the issue of what happens with the Assad regime and potentially what follows it. All sorts of issues, and that's before we even get to Iran, which I would argue is the core issue on the ground there. In your view, what is the U.S. national interest in Syria?
I think you're absolutely right to identify Iran as the core issue. Our engagement in the Middle East on a strategic level has to do with the states and the balance of power and the order in the Middle East that emerges. And Iran is the principal challenger to that order that wishes to replace the United States and to challenge its alliance system there. And to do so, it has a large force of Shiite militias that are run by its own revolutionary guards. And these militias are supplied with long-range rockets that then threaten U.S. allies as well as key strategic routes, like, for instance, in the Gulf, in the Red Sea, and the Hormuz Straits, where a lot of the world's oil is shipped out. So this provides Iran with a very strong strategic position in the Middle East, and that's directly counter to the U.S. That is the primary focus for the United States. The issue in Syria is that Syria is kind of a linchpin for their sort of territorial realm that extends from Iraq, which has fallen directly under their influence, to Beirut, where they run the place directly through sort of an IRGC force that's called Hezbollah. And this situation is precisely why the Syria decision, while at the same time very important and and has a serious cost, at the same time cannot be divorced from the broader strategy that the United States and policy that the United States is pursuing in the region. The fact that the United States is funding and supporting and propping up Iranian orders on both sides of Syria, in Lebanon and Iraq, works at cross purposes with its expressed desire to cut off Iran from Syria. It doesn't make sense. So we're trying to fight in Syria this connection over land that Iran is seeking to establish, while at the same time empowering them on both sides of it. And the reason why there is this confusion, it's because our other general policy in the Middle East, which is our counterterrorism policy, like the anti-ISIS policy or the anti-Al-Qaeda policy, often works at cross purposes with this other sort of more geopolitical or strategic focused policy that we have against Iran or against maybe Russian incursion in the Middle East. And until these two things are brought into alignment and the paradox inherent in them is resolved, the conversation about Syria is going to continue to remain lacking and incomplete. And I think that's really the biggest challenge now to grapple with the president's decision, is to maybe take a long and hard look at how these two policies are working against each other.
And this was a very predictable circumstance, the paradox that you talked about of essentially the idea of U.S. counterterrorism interests dictating that the U.S. must go in and annihilate the Islamic State. And I always argued, and many writers and analysts have argued, that the real problem is going to be after the Islamic State is destroyed, that Iran or Iranian proxies fill that vacuum. And I would always argue that, in effect, the Sunni jihadists, clearing them was sort of the fertile ground from which the Shiite crescent would spring. And as you mentioned, the real interest in Syria, one of the real interests, is preventing this land bridge, quote unquote, from Iraq through Syria and then over to Lebanon, which is largely Hezbollah controlled. So immediate question is, what difference do the 2,000 troops make? They were in strategically significant territory from the perspective of the natural resources there. What else were those 2,000 troops doing from the perspective of U.S. national interest in Iran?
Right. So the primary thing, as you mentioned, is natural resources. They were denying the Assad regime access to the area of the country that has gas and oil fields. They're not, by the way, these are not like Saudi Arabia levels of gas and oil or energy resources. They're very finite and mostly decrepit. But the Assad regime, which is completely in ruins, needs them to prop up its electricity grid, let's say, and whatever remains of its production facilities. And what it does is, because it had lost access to them, Iran had to compensate for this loss. So it was costing Iran to prop up the regime. Now, if they get to access them, obviously it will relieve some of that burden on Iran. But aside from that, there was a sense that the U.S. presence there would act as a roadblock toward this the Iranian routes that they wanted to establish all the way to Lebanon. Now, this is important to understand. This was not an active policy. There was no actual anti-Iran policy that was being implemented. It was aspirational. We were using our presence in Syria simply by just being there in order to block them. And it worked. It was blocking them. But at the same time, these guys were also flying planes directly into Beirut airport, where we finance the Lebanese armed forces, which are deployed at the airport. So yes, we were blocking one aspect of the bridge, but at the same time, the other, and only passively. And remember, there's a lot of people. The Pentagon was not on board with an anti-Iran policy in Syria. There's a lot of people on the Hill which were opposed to extending the existing authorization for the use of military force to include an anti-Iran mission. So there was a lot of question marks. So it was simply by virtue of our presence there that we were blocking. But even as we were doing so, our presence in Iraq or our mission in Iraq was empowering IRGC militias to deploy to that border with Syria, and our policy in Lebanon, where we were supporting the LAF, which is doing nothing to prevent the aerial bridge of Iran of landing shipments directly in Beirut airport.
So to distill it, in a sense, it was incidental that we were blocking Iran from having its Shia crescent by having these 2,000 troops, because that was not the primary purpose of having the troops there. But your broader point is that there's an incoherence or an inconsistency in American foreign policy and we haven't had a national conversation about what our interests necessarily are in the Middle East writ large, and then as between Shia and Sunni Islamic supremacists, what our objective is, whether it's a counterbalance between them or something else. Obviously, under the Obama administration, it was to elevate the Shia over the Sunni, and now there's been somewhat of a realignment in that. But the Trump administration, has talked about maximum pressure on Iran. But to your point, there are policies that run across cross currents. One of them being, and this is something that you've harped on, our support for the Lebanese government, which you argue, in effect, is the Iranian government via Hezbollah. Speak a little bit to what's going on in Lebanon.
Sure. Just to tie that in, I mean, so the thing that the previous administration did was not only to take a pro-Iran tilt, but it specifically designed our counterterrorism policy against ISIS to reinforce its tilt towards Iran by partnering with local counterterrorism partners like the Lebanese armed forces in Lebanon, which is really not doing anything against ISIS anyway, but primarily the Shiite forces in Iraq, to reinforce the broader alignment with Iran. So it's not that we were left with a choice of either this or that. We were using one specifically to buttress the other. Now, in this is what happened in Lebanon. They used the idea of the Lebanese armed forces as a counterterrorism partner, which is a complete joke. These guys don't do anything in that sense. And we did that so as to kind of extend a protective umbrella to preserve the stability of Lebanon against any potential Israeli strike and any potential backlash from the Syria war, where Hezbollah was using Lebanese territory to launch its ethnic cleansing campaign in defense of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And what was the Lebanese armed forces doing? Securing its back against any backlash that was coming from Syria and securing the border to allow Hezbollah facility of movement across the border. So this was, in a sense, how our policy there helped create the situation. And right now, Hezbollah dominates the political landscape in Lebanon entirely. Their coalition has control over the parliament. They are going to control the incoming government with all its top ministries. And we have no answer to this. We have no idea how to address the fact that a lot of the post-9/11 policies that we did, be they counterterrorism or democracy promotion, specifically in the Levant with Lebanon and Iraq, because they're relevant to the Syria question, where you have now governments that are partners or clients of the United States or recipients of aid of the United States that are at the same time Iranian satrapies. This is a big, big problem that we need to grapple with as we consider what we want to do in Syria and how any potential U.S. force in Syria or around Syria, and let's not forget that the United States is very much present around Syria, how that is going to work in a broader anti-Iran strategy that is yet to be fully defined, articulated, and adopted.
Yeah, and whether incidental or not, of course, Israel is going to protect its national interests, and we've seen incursions into both finding the tunnels that Hezbollah had built from Lebanon into Israel, and of course engaging in strikes as well to its north in Syria, and apparently coordinating with Russia in some of its activities as well, so as to keep a bit of a lid on the broader geopolitical issues that might transpire. But of course, Israel has well over 100,000 missiles pointed at it. So that is really the near-term escalation that we're sort of seeing at this point. I did want to ask, because I mentioned at the top all of these different actors on the ground, the Turks, the Iranians, Assad's forces, the Kurds, the Russians, these are not, when it comes to specifically Turkey, Iran, and Russia, these are not natural friends by any stretch. They are partners historically, in particular in recent years, but they aren't naturally allied, and in fact, their interests probably differ in any of a number of situations. Do you see there being stability between a Syria that does not have U.S. forces on the ground, or could it be that this actually destabilizes the situation in some sense?
Look, Syria, I mean, in as much as it can be considered a real state, okay, is historically really, what we're seeing now, the current state of Syria, is really its historically natural state, meaning that it functions as a series of buffer zones for bigger powers that are around it. And what we have been seeing in Syria, I mean, now it's kind of, they're clawing back some of the territory. But what we had, for instance, in the south, where you had a Jordanian-Israeli zone, for instance, where that was acted as a buffer, for instance. Now that's gone. But now you see it with the Turks in the north, and you might see it again developing in some capacity in the east. That's how Syria usually has functioned throughout history. But in terms of the actual players, I mean, I know there is a sense here that the Turks aren't our friends, and we've certainly had a million problems with them. But that somehow the Kurds in Syria are our natural allies, and I would actually take some issue with that. Not just because the Kurdish forces in Syria are actually part of a U.S. designated terrorist group, but it's also because if you look at them at what they've been doing in Syria, they've been hedging from the very beginning Okay, so they've had their own ties with Russia and Iran and the Assad regime in western Syria. They were instrumental, for instance, in the fall of Aleppo. They helped and worked with them, with the Russians in that regard. And I think that they always understood that and this is a game that a lot of minorities in the Middle East play, like, for instance, the Maronites in Lebanon played this game with the Israelis and the Syrians back in the 70s and early 80s. So they hedge, they balance one force against another. They were using the U.S. cover that they had in order to achieve maximum gain while keeping a line to the Russians for the day when the United States leaves. And so I think we have to understand, and this goes back to the issue of counterterrorism as a guiding principle. We're looking at the Kurds as allies in the war against ISIS. They're looking at U.S. support to achieve much, much bigger ambitions that pose a threat to a lot of their neighbors. And they are, if you look at these neighbors, be they Arabs, Sunni Arabs who distrust them, be they other Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan who are, let's say, allied with Turkey, for instance, who also are hostile to them, or the Kurds themselves, you see that structurally their choices for alliances are limited. So it makes sense for them, from their perspective, to align with Russia eventually. So basically our position with them there was deferring this alignment. But now maybe that the time for that has come, and they might need to make whatever moves they need to make. But the issue of how we choose local partners for what policies and how we separate that from broader strategic interests, let's say from counterterrorism to broader strategic interests, that's going to be a key issue for the United States to grapple with moving forward. It's not that you just kind of pick whatever local asset you have because your priority is counterterrorism, and you ignore what their calculations are, what the calculations of the neighbors are, and what your broader strategic picture in the region should be. I think it's time really to start thinking about this, because now there's a lot of confusion. People are upset about the Syria withdrawal for a variety of reasons, having to do with ISIS, having to do with Turkey, having to do with the Kurds, having to do with Russia, having to do with Iran. We have to parse each of these issues and see where the United States' interest is, and how a potential deployment in Syria would serve that interest and not undermine it.
Yeah, and first thing I would say is amen to the idea of needing to step back and look at the broader strategy and our goals and objectives in the region versus tactical concerns. And it feels as if we've been operating on a tactical level for a long time in this part of the world. Tony, the last question I'd like to ask you before we step out for a second is, if you were put in charge of a maximum pressure campaign on Iran, and we deemed essentially counterbalancing Iran or diminishing Iran's power throughout the region as the primary objective of U.S. policy in the Middle East, what would that maximum pressure campaign look like?
First of all, God help us if I actually were put in that position. But since you asked, I think the financial campaign that the administration has started is very important and needs to be truly maximized. Meaning, we have to consider whether those waivers, there's an argument to be made that they're good for stabilizing the market before you intensify them. But anyway, they need, for instance, like giving waivers for Iraq, so that the Iranians continue to sell them oil raises a question mark. But anyway, so intensify the financial campaign and the sanctions campaign, to be sure. Extend that into Syria, for instance. Deny any influx of any reconstruction money or any investment, and make it clear to everyone involved that anyone who does this is going to be penalized. Same thing for any other assets that they have in Lebanon, in Iraq, or whatever. So there's a financial aspect that needs to be completely maximized. Second, for instance, people who are now objecting to the Syria withdrawal issue are the same people who are arguing for the United States to end support, however minimal that was, to Saudi Arabia, which is fighting an Iranian proxy in Yemen on the Red Sea. This is a critical U.S. interest as well. I think a way to do that is to be able to actually help make sure that the Iranian proxy is defeated and to make sure that the IRGC missiles are not placed on the Red Sea or on the borders of a critical U.S. ally, one whose importance extends to the global economy. Third, I think we should be very, very strongly supportive of any Israeli activity, and not just rhetorically or diplomatically or politically vis-a-vis the Russians, but also even even in terms of intelligence sharing or materiel or planning even for the Israelis to make sure that they can target Iran's infrastructure in Syria. And the same thing should be applied to the Lebanese, that basically they should be told that if they're not going to be able to handle this with all the aid that we're giving them, the Iranian weapons shipments and all that stuff that we saw with the tunnels, then they should be made it should be made very clear to them that we are going to support Israel 100% if it needs to take care of the problem on its border and its national security.
We've been speaking with Tony Badran. He's a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I urge you to read everything he writes, whether at Tablet, USA Today, or elsewhere. Tony, thanks so much for coming on the program today.
My pleasure, Ben. Thank you.
All right, and thank you, of course, all for listening to us. We're going to take a quick break here on the Wilkow Majority. This is Ben Weingarten in for Andrew Wilkow, 866-957-2874. That's 866-95-PATRIOT. Be right back.